My name is Rob Hubert. I'm the director of the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our continuing series of talks of the Highlander series. Whenever you watch West Wing, and you watch and you see all the journalists are always super smart, super professional. They know how to ask the right questions. They are on top of their game. Well, the real life version of West Wing is right here before us, and that's Murray Brewster. Murray represents, and I say this completely unabashedly, he is our leading defense journalist in Canada.
I was telling my kids I was coming out here to speak to you tonight, and one of them said, Dad, they only let you start to give you, they only let you give these kinds of speeches when they're getting ready to put you out to pasture." Now, my children have a wonderful sense of humor. Whether they stay in the will, that's a completely different story. Now, despite my best efforts to quash these things, um, rumors of my retirement, because I've been in journalism 40 years, more than 40 years, and doing defense for 20 years, rumors of my retirement just keep resurfacing. And they keep resurfacing in some of the most unusual places. For example, the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner, which is the annual exercise in journalists reminding themselves and the public that they're not comedy writers. And but there is a rogues gallery that they go through and poke fun at journalists. And this year, and I quote, "D&D is looking at retiring old equipment. They're still trying to figure out how to retire Murray." So I will state, for the record this evening, that this is a news-free zone. No news tonight. I'm not announcing anything. I am simply here to inform and entertain, or, depending upon who you are, to entertain and inform. Um, it has often been said that behind every successful man, there is an overwhelmingly astonished wife. That is the way it was in my household. And my wife is unfortunately no longer with us. But my children gleefully step into that role, as you can hear, to, as my wife used to put it, keep it real, baby. And that's what I'm going to try to do for you tonight. If you want to know what it's like to be a defense journalist in this country, the conversation begins with family. Because I wouldn't be who I am, what I am, or where I am without my family. Their love, their sense of humor, their patience, and their thick skins. You have to have a thick skin as a journalist in this country, especially these days. And the same goes for your family. They have stuck with me throughout this crazy journey. The sometimes dangerous assignments, the sometimes prolonged absences, and the occasional public and social media criticism of their father. That they have done so with humor and with grace is more credit to them than it is to me. Now, I don't want this to sound too heavy, because honestly, we have had a lot of fun. Not many kids can say that they have been to prime ministers' garden parties or celebrated many of their milestone life events with dinner in the parliamentary restaurant. They've met ambassadors, they've met whistleblowers, they've met senior military leaders, some of them at our dining room table. And they have been privileged to occasionally glimpse at the affairs of the nation and some of the most important events that shape it, and continue to shape it, even to today. Sometimes it's been vicarious, by listening to me moan about my day. Other times it's been through direct conversations. But it's been a very interesting life for them and for me. If it wasn't my wife's wardrobe challenges, stockings that refused to stay up during a press gallery dinner when our guest was Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, the commander of the Army that year, he was very gracious. It was her grumbling sometimes and complaining about how Justin Trudeau was always late, no matter what the event. And one year he wanted to meet my press gallery dinner guests, and that had taken its way from the reception. And her complaints were long and loud, and all of this was much to the amusement of the RCMP detail. If it wasn't that, it was my daughter, who now works for the federal government, at a book club, being asked by someone in the military whether we were any relation, and her saying, "Yeah, that's my dad." "You're Murray Brewster's daughter?" The first thought in the poor girl's mind was, "Oh, this is going to go one of two ways." The guy turned out to be very kind. But if it wasn't that, it was my son, who was born in mid-September, who in 2011 refused to celebrate his birthday until I got home safely from New York City following the 9/11 attacks. So one of the tough aspects of being a defense journalist has been watching family reconcile the gap between the guy they see on television or hear on the radio or read online and the guy who sits on the couch next to them and eats Fritos and watches Star Trek in 60 minutes. Another tough aspect has been reconciling how my choice of career has caused them worry and pain sometimes. For almost 30 years now, I have charged into disaster and war zones. I mentioned 9/11. That was basically the setup for my career in war corresponding, or should I say, it was the beginning. And my poor wife. There was only a half an hour turnaround from the time I was ordered to go to departure for New York City. My colleagues and I drove there, but in the rushed goodbyes, I had forgotten that friends had warned me a couple of weeks prior to that, that they were going to ask Ilan to be in their wedding party with a bouquet of flowers and a card. I think you know where this is going. 2 days go by before I can call home from New York. And throughout that time, she's watching all of those horrific images on that visceral 24-hour news cycle. When we finally did get on the phone, she was weepy. The day of the attack, the florist showed up on the front step with a bouquet and the invitation. I started to cry, she told me. I thought that they were from you. I thought that you were trying to tell me that you didn't think you were coming home. I started to laugh because I hadn't slept in 3 days. And I said, "Honey," I said, "I love you very much." I said, "But if I'm about to die, the first thought in my head is not going to be, oh, must send Elaine flowers." She stopped crying, started laughing, and then got really mad. And she didn't let me forget it for the rest of her life. There were times in Afghanistan when we'd be on the phone and the base would be rocketed. She would literally hear the whoosh and the explosion on the other end. "What was that?" "Oh shit, I gotta go." Um, and then there was a time in 2014 when a British journalist staying in the same guest house in Kabul, where I was murdered while in the streets of the city's diplomatic quarter. There was some confusion at the guest house because the staff had initially thought it was me who had been shot. Later, and since the wire copy from Reuters didn't name the journalist, I called home to warn her, don't look at the newspaper. Too late. I do deeply regret all of the worry that I caused her. My kids don't talk about it very much. The only real opposition I've ever faced from them came at the onset of the full open warfare in Ukraine. I was getting ready to go, and my kids basically asked, why? Like, come on, Dad, 15 months in Afghanistan, your time in Iraq, when ISIS was at its full bloom, and now Ukraine. Haven't you done enough? Haven't you had enough? Now, I promised myself that I wouldn't go all motherhood and apple pie on you this evening, but What I told them is important, and it's important for you to understand the approach that journalists have in these circumstances. But I just looked at them and I said, now was not the time for people, people of good conscience, to sit on the sidelines. I had experience and insight. I knew how to handle myself in a war zone, and particularly under fire. And there were important stories that needed to be told. It was one of the few times that my kids and I had to agree to disagree. Now, I don't think they've necessarily changed their minds, but I think they understood or necessarily appreciated what I was saying better after reading and seeing some of the pieces that I had written while there in 2022 and 2023, including the story of the woman who ran the funeral home in Bucha, where the Russian massacres took place, the story of doctors in Kherson who falsified medical records to prevent babies from being taken by the Russians from their pediatric ward, and most importantly, and the piece that I'm most proud of, was a documentary on the war through the eyes of children. There was an almost, I get it, but I don't like it. I get it, but I don't like it attitude from my kids. Now, if there's one thing that I've learned in more than 20 years is that war is not politics. It's not grand strategy. It's not equipment. It's people. I learned that from my late colleague, Stephen Thorne, who blazed the trail for the rest of us in Afghanistan. He taught us, me and others, that we had a duty to bear witness. He also taught me to stand my ground. Now, there's a personal cost to doing this kind of work, but the humanity, the voices of the people caught up in the most inhuman of circumstances deserve to be heard. I know that my wife understood that. She was a woman who was sparing in her praise, but I know she was very proud of a story in 2007 which forced the government to raise the funeral stipend for families whose sons and daughters, husbands and fathers, daughters and sisters had died in combat. Families were literally, at that time, paying a good chunk of the funeral expenses of their loved ones out of their own pocket because D&D had not raised the rate in years. She was also equally proud of the story about an EOD operator who disarmed a live Taliban suicide bomber. Now that story appeared in 2013, but the genesis of that piece goes back a year when a colleague and I were looking at a list of Governor General's award citations because they were going to be the last combat medals from the war in Afghanistan. And we realized that we were exiting the war in Afghanistan without awarding a VC. So my colleague and I basically asked the question, what does a Canadian soldier have to do to win the VC? So what we did was we laid the VC citations down from the First World War, the Second World War, and the Medal of Valor citations, Star of Valor citations, and found, we all laid them down side by side, we found there was little difference. In fact, the acts in Afghanistan in some cases exceeded some of the VC citations during the First World War. So that became my Remembrance Day story in 2012. But as an aside, this is a complete aside for you, that particular story, if you're familiar with the attempts to get Star of Valor medals upgraded to VCs, which has been a Facebook thing, the inspiration to that movement came from that story, because one of the principles behind it was a guy by the name of Bruce Moncor. And he was on me for years about how it should happen. But after that story ran in 2012, the phone rang not long afterwards, and it was a former soldier turned RCMP bomb disposal guy. Now, we could not report on the activities of EOD operators during the Afghan war. It was OPSEC, and I respect that. But this guy told me about what he described as the greatest unrecognized act of courage he'd ever witnessed. One of his teammates, who in 2009 cut the explosive vest off a live would-be suicide bomber. This guy never received any recognition and basically returned home a mess. I tracked that soldier down. His name is Bruno. It took me 8 months to get him to talk. 8 months of persistent calling and emailing. Finally, he did give me an interview, and the quote still sticks with me. So I had my face on top of a bomb 2 and 3 times a day for 6 months, and it's no wonder I have PTSD. And I asked him at the end of the interview the same question I asked all veterans of either the Second World War, Korea, or Afghanistan. And the question kind of varies, but it goes somewhat like this. Everybody leaves a little piece of themselves behind on the battlefield. And it's a struggle to find your way home. How do you know when you've made it home? Bruno couldn't answer me, and he was quite upset about that. When the story came out on the eve of Remembrance Day 2013, strangers approached him in the coffee shop. They'd seen his picture, they'd read the story, and they thanked him. Long forgotten friends and comrades called him, rallied around him. D&D, by the way, was unmoved. They didn't do anything for him. They don't like it when anyone questions an oversight. But Bruno called me a couple of days after that story, and he said he was ready to answer the question now. And he said, listen, he said, I haven't found my way home yet. He said, but your story, he said, your eloquent words have shown me the way home. It was one of the greatest compliments I've ever received. And today, he's a motivational speaker. Now, folks, this night is not intended to be a greatest hits collection, okay? My point, which I am trying to reinforce, is that defense reporting is about people. Too often, we get caught up in the politics. Lately, it's procurement. I mean, good God, don't get me started with the F-35 and the Gripen. Forget all of that, all right? It is important, okay? It is important. But so much time and oxygen is sucked up in debates that literally have been going on for decades. Spring of 1997. I am not a full-time defense reporter this time. I'm splitting my time between covering national politics and defense. But I wrote a piece about the planned Sea King replacement. Fast forward to the fall of 2013. I was writing about the government of the day's consideration of ditching the replacement helicopter, the Cyclones. I found the 1997 story among my papers. Whole blocks of text from the 1997 story could have been cut and pasted into what I was writing in the fall of 2013, 16 years later. And I looked at my wife and I said, am I in journalistic purgatory? And she said, no, honey. She's just remember, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. In many respects, that is what we have been doing with procurement. And we've been doing it without shame and without reflection. Is it changing? I hope so. What also needs to change, as I have been arguing, is the lens through which we look at defense. It is not only important to tell the stories of people for the public today, but it is important because we are speaking to history. And often there is no sense among either our leaders, political, institutional, that they are speaking to history. I mean, people ask me, what's it like to deal with the Department of National Defense? And I usually say two things. One, on a good day, it's like trying to talk to a junior high class. And I mean that institutionally. I don't mean that individually, because some of my closest friends and some of the smartest people that I know are people who are in uniform or had been in uniform. But the second thing I say is they often wouldn't know a good story if they tripped over it, or they wouldn't know what the elements of a good story. And just so that you know, I have often lectured at the Canadian Forces Command College, the Army Staff College, and their public affairs branch, and I have said exactly the same thing to their faces. Um, where D&D is concerned, also don't get me started about public accountability. I'm in a rather grumpy mood right now with them where that's concerned. But let me give you this illustration. During the Afghan war, there was a bombed out compound near Kandahar airfield known as Tarnak Farms. It was an old agricultural research station that was appropriated by Al Qaeda during Taliban 1.0. It was reportedly the place where bin Laden plotted 9/11, and it was bombed to dust naturally in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Now, I've been out there in 2007, and most of the land surrounding the compound was desert, barren, fallow. But 2010, the Kandahar provincial government had reclaimed enough of the surrounding property that they wanted to invite tenant farmers in. The Afghan government, national government, however, wanted the ruins of the old Al Qaeda compound to be bulldozed and unexploded munitions there taken out. I thought, okay, that's a neat story. So I disembedded myself, like basically left the protection of the military, as I often did when I was there, and traveled with my fixture to Tarnak, where we met the head of the provincial agriculture department. The two of us are standing beside an irrigation ditch. It is absolutely coursing with water. And he looks at me and he says, "Do you know where that water's coming from?" And I said, "No." He said, "Dala." The Dala Dam was Canada's signature development project in Kandahar. He said, "You see this?" He pointed to the fields and the workers. He said, "You people have done that." He said, "You should be very proud." I mean, like honestly, I get goosebumps in the back of my neck whenever I think about that particular moment, because we were at a point in the war where we were all asking, "What the hell has this been for?" We were about to exit combat. There had been well over 100 casualties at that point. And I looked out at those fields and I thought, what a great story. As tiny an illustration as it was, here was a way to explain to Canadians what all the blood and treasure had been about. We were taking the land around the compound where this goddamn war had started and turning it back to the people. At Kandahar Airfield, I asked the military and the development officers for comment. Crickets. I asked officials in Ottawa for comment. Crickets. The messaging by that point had been so centralized and so politicized that no one wanted to talk, because that narrative had not been thought up in some boardroom in Ottawa or by some 25-year-old PMO staffer. It didn't exist. So the story went out anyway, but with just Afghan voices. With I will say, with the exception of one lonely development officer who gave me an absolutely incoherent comment. But 6 months later, the D&D PCO PMO machine decided, that is a story. So they bundled up the journalists to Kandahar Airfield, drove them out there in flak jackets and helmets and in an armored vehicle, and tried to recreate the piece on the eve of the 9th anniversary of 9/11 without Afghan voices. Yes, they had to get the terrorism message in there, even though by that point in the war, their own messaging was that this war was about getting little girls into school. With all due respect to my colleagues that day, the stories that were filed, the stories were just absolutely rinsed in politics and jingoism, and it was just sad. I was very sad after reading all of that. Our collective memories, or what little the current generation knows, is shaped by the stories that others have told, that other nations have told, be it the US or the UK. And when we are remembered, if we are remembered at all, it is by the populations that we liberated, often not our own people and certainly not our allies. Now, yes, Canadians show up on Remembrance Day. That is pretty much the only time of year they're comfortable talking about war. Mostly, though, it's about wars long past. I know because I write a lot of the Remembrance Day stories, and I see what gets played. Part of that is individual and institutional reluctance to talk, which I illustrated here. But part of it is also society. Historian Jack Granstein noted during the Afghan War that there was a deep pacifist streak in the Canadian psyche that occasionally manifests itself in anti-Americanism. Americans are warlike, we're not Americans. The we're not Americans aspect is found new life recently, but that cannot and should not be a defining aspect of our character. Why do we have a pacifist streak? Well, my theory, and it's largely unsupported by research, mind you, is it all goes back to the trauma of the First World War. And if you look at our history, I mean, think about it for a moment. We at the time we were a country of 8 million people. We put 650,000 men and women in uniform, and we lost 66,000 dead and another 170,000 wounded. There was no village, town, or city in this country that had not been touched by that war. Often people will say that Canada as a nation, it was born on Vimy Ridge, on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. I say that Canada became a nation when it demanded a seat at the table in Versailles. The pacifist streak that we often have to deal with has nothing to do with politics, but has everything to do with the feeling that I think many Canadians often have is that we are often called upon to fight other people's wars for them. And that's why we should not be shy about telling our stories or appreciating our own stories. To talk about war doesn't mean that you favor it. It means we acknowledge the reality and we acknowledge the people who are willing to shed their blood and the blood of others in our name. My sense is the vast majority of Canadians are there and they understand that. Whereas I would suggest to you, my experience has been politicians and institutions often are not there. During the Afghan War, I don't think I was prouder than to see the Highway of Heroes and the outpouring of respect from ordinary Canadians who lined the roads and overpasses outside of Trenton. They showed respect for the soldiers who gave up their lives, even though public opinion poll after public opinion poll reminded us regularly that there was deep opposition to the war itself. It says an awful lot about the character of this country, in my estimation, where we can hold two contradictory views like that. The Americans couldn't do it during Vietnam, but we did it during Afghanistan. Our refusal, this is a bit of a painful point for me, our refusal as a society to acknowledge or to deal with the legacy of war, Afghanistan in particular, is deeply troubling. Perhaps more so in light of the world that we are entering today. A colleague of mine, I call him a brother from another mother. His name's Louis Palut. He and I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan together, and we collaborated on a documentary in 2015 called Kandahar Journals, using combat footage that he had shot on his digital camera and camcorder. We told the story of the war through Louis' lens. Trust me, it was no rah-rah, hoo-ha piece of propaganda. It was an unflinching, visceral look at the human side of war. The documentary won 6 film festival awards outside of Canada. Its international screening and debut was at the U.S. National Gallery of Art in Washington. It was screened in Paris. It was screened in Berlin. It was screened everywhere at film festivals except in Canada. The doc did open at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and it also played at the Bytown Cinema for one night. But that was something we, as the documentary filmmakers, paid for. No Canadian film festival would touch it. The reluctance to acknowledge that portion of our history extends to institutions. Unlike our major allies, Canada is alone in not taking a public look at the Afghan war. What went right? What went wrong? Why were we there? What was our national interest? And what can we learn from this? There were internal reviews. Don't try to ask for them under access to information. You know, the kinds of things politically and these kinds of reviews are the kinds of things that politically and institutionally mature countries do, and they do them in public. The Brits, the Americans, even NATO did its own review and made it public. Now, notice how politics is starting to creep into the narrative here. You ask what it's like to be a defense correspondent and a defense reporter in this country. Often, I like to describe it as being like the Maytag repairman. One lonely guy, or in correct acknowledgement of my other colleagues, a handful of lonely guys. For the millennials in the audience, you can Google that reference. But there was a moment a few weeks ago that sort of perfectly captured where defense reporting sits in the political consciousness of the country. In South Korea last fall, at the shipyard where they're building submarines, Prime Minister Carney lined up on the jetty right next to the South Korean PM, 2 defense ministers, photo op. He looks over at me as I'm standing with the cameras. He says, "Murray," I said, "you like this stuff." As though covering defense and the military was some kind of fetish. "Are you excited to see all of this?" And I just kind of shrugged and I said, "No." I said, "I've already seen it." And he looked at me and I said, "Well, I was here last spring. I did a full documentary for the National, which, by the way, had almost 1 million views. He must have missed it. And he was a little busy at the time. I think he was in the middle of an election, but we'll cut him some slack." See, but then again, I was reading a news release the other day. It says nobody watches CPC. But even within my own bureau, even within my own institution, defense reporting was seen for many years something akin to rooming with a crazy old uncle who watched World War II movies. Now, in fairness, I do have some family members who treat me like that, so I'm not going to be too hard on my colleagues. But I quite vividly recall warning my colleagues in the run-up to Russia's full invasion of Ukraine. Hey, this is going to happen. This is how it's going to happen, and this is how we are going to have to cover it. I was given the nickname Dr. Doom. It happened, and it happened exactly the way that I had predicted, prompting one of my colleagues to apologize afterwards publicly. Did I think the Ukrainians were going to roll over to the Russians? Absolutely not. Why? Because I had been there. many times because I know the Ukrainian character and because I stood in a frozen field 10 days before the full invasion and watched their territorial battalions exercise. These are the weekend warriors, the reservists. There were kids as young as 17 years old whose rifles were bigger than they were. And there were also guys as old as me. And they were all practicing how to fight Russians and kill Russian tanks. That spoke volumes in terms of insight. There were both women and men, and it became very clear to me, even as a lot of the intelligence agencies and the commentators were pontificating Kyiv was going to fall in 3 days. I said, no, it's not. Now, that brings me to the point about the importance of bearing witness. If there is a defense of defense reporting, it lays upon the foundation that our job in a war is to bear witness on behalf of our fellow citizens to the acts that are carried out in our name. It may be a quaint, old-fashioned notion in this hyper-partisan era, but it is still an important principle, and it's one that I've tried to live by. If there is also a defense of defense reporting in peacetime, it lays upon the foundation of political and institutional accountability. I opened my newsfeed today, and I found Trump accusing defense reporters of treason for their coverage of the war in Iran. This is the world that we live in. A few years ago, I was forced to sit through a black tie dinner in Ottawa where someone formerly quite senior railed on about the woke media and how there were no good defense reporters left in the country. There were times when I used to read emails and X comments to my wife, who would just sit there quietly and look at me. And then she'd smile and she'd say, "So who are you going to piss off today?" And I would say, "Nobody." She said, "Then you're not doing your job." And she would just cackle afterwards. All kidding aside, these are extraordinary, unprecedented, even frightening times. Much of what I have illustrated today are battles of the past. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's a fitting point in my career. What I hope you take away from tonight is that the people who bring you the news are human beings, many of them deeply principled and committed to public service. They're not robots. They're not political shills. They're not culture warriors. They're people. I also hope that my colleagues, if they're listening, remind themselves more often that there are people behind the uniforms and people whose voices deserve to be heard, even in the most horrible of circumstances. From a public policy perspective, I'm hoping that our leaders and institutions recognize that they have a duty to explain themselves, to speak to history, and to be accountable for their decisions, good, bad, or indifferent. The stakes today are too high for it to be any other way. Thank you for your attention. Most reporters become generalists. I'm lucky. I mean, I'm a dinosaur, but I'm lucky I have been able to concentrate on one beat for 20 years. And I mean, and today it certainly pays dividends because I jokingly, I spend half my time writing stories. I spend a quarter of my time consulting with my colleagues and educating them, and I spend the other quarter of the time just trying to educate the public. So there are few in number, but there's some really sharp minds that are coming up. I think that she certainly has a much longer runway in her career than myself, but I have enormous respect for Mercedes Stevenson. I really do. and there are some people who are going to be able to carry it on, but it's a very narrow field right now, and there needs to be a structural change in the media because there are not too many publications or broadcast outlets that allow their journalists to cover one subject, be it defense, be it health, or whatever. And we're actually, I think, in my personal estimate, and I've said this publicly on many occasions, we're poorer because of that. We're poorer because of the loss uh, of not institutional knowledge as much as expertise. Absolutely, completely, and totally zero. There is no government oversight. There is no censoring, even during the Afghan war. How how we struggle to get information has been in the either the inability or the unwillingness of governments or institutions to answer questions. So there is no censorship whatsoever. There is a sea change happening right now in terms of the political culture. Um, I think that both in and see, you'll notice I'm very specific when I say leaders, politicians, and institutions, because they are actually three separate and distinct entities. I would suggest to you that uh, the political and even the institutional establishments were very slow in this country to catch up to what the public already perceived as and could see as major changes beyond our borders and the threats that were developing. So you've seen um, the government and the politicians play catch up. We started to see in the spring of 2014 uh, public opinion polls where Canadians were saying, yeah, you should be spending 2% on defense. And that was not the political nor the institutional position. And it took a change in leadership um, of the Liberal Party to see that change. So I'm I'm cautiously optimistic that we're coming into politically and institutionally a headspace where we are getting prepared. Because to your point, yes, something bad is coming. You can see it. You don't know how or where, but I mean, we look at the Middle East right now and how that could potentially spiral out of control, particularly if the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues and the economic shock throughout the world. Um, so, yes.